All right, it's 9 o'clock, so we'll go ahead and get started. Good morning, everyone. Thank you very much for joining our first rules webinar of the year. And I'd like to thank the Rules Committee, Alice, Clark, Tom for helping out, and everyone else involved. Just a few quick things to go over before we get started. If everyone can remain on mute during the presentation, that would be wonderful, so there isn't any background noise going on. It's up to you if you want to keep your cameras on or off during the presentation. It makes no difference to us. There is one button on your screen we'd all like you to avoid hitting. It looks like a rectangle with an arrow pointing up. That's the Present Now button. Please do not click that, as that will interrupt Tom's presentation. If you have any technical issues, please put those into the chat and I will do my best to help through those. Just be aware that a lot of the times the issues stem from your own Wi-Fi or internet connection. There are designated portions of the presentation that are set for questions. So if you have any questions throughout the presentation, hold them for those moments. If you have anything more urgent, please put those in the chat. And then as those question periods come up, I can prompt Tom. If anyone has dialed in via telephone today, please send me an email at mfrey@pgahq.com. That way we'll make sure you get your MSR credits for this morning. And finally, we are recording this webinar. So if you ever need to refer back to it or would like to share it with any of your other staff members, it will be available on our YouTube channel. With that, I'd like to first introduce Mr. Clark Lewis, as he has a rendition to present to us.
Thank you, Matt. That's our custom now to sing a patriotic song. So we're going to continue that custom. As the storm clouds gather far across the sea, let us pledge allegiance to a land that's free. Let us all be grateful for a land so fair, as we raise our voices in a solemn prayer. God bless America, land that I love. Stand beside her and guide her through the night with a light from above. From the mountains to the prairies, to the oceans white with foam. God bless America, my home, sweet home. God bless America, my home, sweet home.
That was wonderful. Thanks, Clark.
Thank you.
Now I'd like to turn it over to Mr. Tom Karpus. Mr. Rules, Tom has served as chair of the National Rules Committee and served on our Rules Committee for quite some time, and he is currently a rules official for PGA Tour Champions. Mr. Karpus, take us away.
All right. Well, thank you, Matt. Good morning, everybody. And Clarky, magnificent. It was great to hear your voice. I know you had COVID and you were struggling there a bit, and I'm just thank God that you're on the mend and that your voice is better than ever. I was thinking, I think 1985 was my first fall meeting, and I'm sure you sang at that meeting. So that's 37 years ago. And what did they call? What was the Mel Torme's nickname? The Velvet Fog.
Yeah,
is that right, Clarky?
The Velvet Fog.
There you go. And that's what you sound like. So
thank you, Tom.
But good morning, everybody. And thanks for taking the time. I know it's we still got a little bit of winter left over, although the weather's moderating. And what we thought we would do, and first of all, as you know, Alice Miller has now taken the reins of the Section Rules Committee from Clarky. So first of all, I think it would be appropriate to thank Clarkey for all the years that he served in that capacity and helped with these rules seminars and did other things in the section. And I think it's pretty awesome. And Clarkey's been on the National Rules Committee, I think, since 2004. And now Alice takes over the reins, and I'm sure she's going to do a great job. She's very, very engaged with the rules and on the national committee, as well as our immediate past president, Jeff Kitty. So it's great that we have 4 people from our section that sit on the National Rules Committee. So it's great to be a part of that group. What I thought we would do this morning is start with this presentation I put together last year for the Southern California PGA. They had a webinar, and they wanted to do something 45 minutes or so. Probably won't even go that long, but it was more, I came up with this concept of, are you rules ready? And for 2022. And there's several components to this. One is rules of golf education. And that's not only for you, but for your members or your customers. Rules of golf materials. Are you ready? Do you have rule books? Do you have access to clarifications, etc.? Golf course marking. Are you getting your golf course marked and ready for the season is very important. Having a hard card and including what model local rules that you want to have, not only for when you play in section events, being familiar with them is important, but also at the club level for your members and customers. You are the rules expert, whether or not you like it or not. You are perceived to be the expert, and sooner or later, perception and reality are going to collide, and you want to be ready for that moment. The next piece, it would be the notice to players, which when you have your member guests, your club championships, whatever they are, you have to prepare a notice for the players and as part of the terms of the competition. So you want to make sure you're prepared in that respect. And then the components of starting and scoring. It's not by accident that at the PGA of America, at the PGA Championship and other majors, PGA of America always puts some of our top officials as starters and in scoring, because those are 2 places where a player could be disqualified. So it's really important that just put my phone on vibrate there. Very important that you're prepared, and especially at the club level. When you have a club championship or a big event, last thing you want to have is have a situation there, and there's some things you can do to help yourself in that respect. So when we get to education, right now there are still some PGA USGA rules workshops that are available that you can attend. They did put together 14 in-person workshops this year. As you probably are aware, last year they were all virtual. This year there's 14 in-person. You can still do a virtual workshop if you want, but you can also go in person and attend one. There's one in March coming up in New Jersey at USGA headquarters close by. If you're interested, and that's certainly one way for you to get yourself up to speed on what's happening in the rules of golf. USGA.org on USGA's website, they have a lot of things on there that you can utilize. Videos, materials, you name it, everything. It's one-stop shopping under the rules section of the USGA's website, and they really do a nice job with organizing that information to help people get up to speed on rules and what's happening. Obviously, we're having these webinars. We're gonna have several of these to help all of you maybe learn a thing or two as you get ready to get yourself back into the book. I know it's nice to have some time off, but it's also time to maybe challenge yourself a little bit and get yourself back into the rule book and get ready. In addition to that, You know, and again, everyone's different. Everyone may want to do different things, but having seminars at your club are a lot of fun. You know, I used to do outdoor things with different groups at the club. For my ladies team, for example, they always wanted an outdoor program, and we used to do obviously some instructional things, but then we also did a rules uh, section, and they loved it. We would get outside and drop some balls on the ground and go through some scenarios to make sure that everybody was up to speed. And in particular, obviously things changed dramatically in 2019. I think we're now going into the fourth year of that, and I think people are starting to get used to it. You know, dropping from knee height and some of the newer things that came about in 2019. But you still want to make sure that you're up to speed, because many of us older people like myself and Clarky, we still remember how things were, and sometimes that gets in the way of the new things. So very, very important to keep up with that. Bulletin boards at the club level are still important. You know, your members walk through the locker rooms or in certain areas of the club, and there's bulletin boards where you can put materials that can be helpful to them, for them to read as they walk through. It's another place for you to spread the word and give that information to your members and customers about rules of golf, and even USGA posters with severe weather and things of that nature. It's a good place to put those things up. I think you're all familiar with those items. And the last piece, obviously, is websites and social media. That's the world we live in. I mean, it's amazing to me. When I didn't get my first computer until 1991, when I went to work for the section. And of course, to think about, I mean, that's only 30 years ago. That's not that long in the span of the whole world. But things, boy, in the last 20 years have really changed in the wake of social media, websites, et cetera. And you see all this information that's out there. And clubs, all clubs now have a website. I mean, imagine that. But it's also a great resource for your members to put information and have it right at their, you know, they can get it on their iPads or on their phones, and they can access information about rules and about what's going on at the club. And same thing with social media. And you can do this via instructional videos. You can do rule segments. You can do a lot of neat things for your members on your club website, if you will. So these are all, it's not just one thing, but if you kind of touch all the bases here in the area of rules of golf education, I think you'll be ready for 2022, and so will your members and your customers. Materials. You know, if you don't have the USGA app on your phone or on an iPad in your golf shop, you need to do it, because it is really easy to use. They do a terrific job, and it's one more resource that can be helpful when you're trying to look up information and everything about the rules of golf. So the USGA app is terrific. So I strongly recommend that you do that. And then we have three books, if you will. You have the Players Edition, which I don't know. I don't see a lot of people using that, but they're out there. And also, I'm going to hold this up. Hopefully, you can see it. This is the This is the rule book, full rules. So you have that. This does not have interpretations in it or anything else. It just has the full rules and definitions. And then you have the official guide, which is the big book. And this is really the Bible, if you will, for to have in your golf shop, to have it readily available for you and your staff to use at a moment's notice. And inside that, it's got everything. It's got the interpretations. In the back, it has committee procedures, which is terrific. Gives you a lot of great recommendations on everything from model local rules to how to mark the golf course, how to set up your competitions, a lot of really good information that can be helpful, particularly if you have a club that runs a lot of events. It's really nice to have. But more importantly, it has the rules in it, and then it's followed. Each section has interpretations, which they're not really decisions like we used to talk about in the old book. The interpretations merely just expand on what's written in the rule book itself. And this latest edition, this book obviously was updated in 2019 with the new code, which I think for the most part has been received very well. In addition to all of this, what many times people forget is there are clarifications that are that came about. These are things that came about after everything was printed in 2019. So things came up, and the USGA and the RNA had to come up with clarifications, which are in addition to the rules. It's an expansion of the rules. So what you want to do is make sure that you print out some hard copies, if you will. Anywhere where you have this official guide, I would suggest printing out a copy of the clarifications and keep that with your rule book, because there are going to be new model local rules that came about after January 1st of 2019, along with rules clarifications that came about. So you want to have access to those because they are in effect, and they're updated quarterly on the USGA's website. They just updated recently. I think the recent update came about, I want to say in December, but they update those quarterly, and many times there's no new ones. So if you have an old copy, it's good, but you want to check that April 1st. Usually that's kind of right before the Masters. Sometimes some things will get changed, and then again, halfway through the year and into the third quarter. So very important that you don't forget about the clarifications. Also, and this is, again, you can access it on your app, on the USGA's website, green reading materials. If you have caddies, if you have yardage books at your club, not everybody has those, but you want to be familiar with those updates in the clarifications for green reading materials. And also there's this plastic template that you can get from the USGA. You can order them online. And basically, if you use yardage books, they have to meet the requirement as noted in the green reading materials. And we're going to actually we'll look at that information when we get to Rule 4.3 in a little bit later. So important to have that information, have that template. And again, wherever you have an official guide, keep one of those rulers handy in case you have a question. The equipment rules. We'll talk about that when we get to Rule 4, but the equipment rules, there's a whole section on this that there's a PDF file that you can download onto your computer. You can print out a copy and have it, again, close by in your golf shop or in your office, at home, and you can keep all this stuff in one central location so that you or your staff can access it if you get a question from one of your members or your customers. So again, important to have that. I know for me, and I think Clarky and Alice and Jeff would probably agree, whenever we get a question on equipment, we all get pretty nervous, because these are some of the more challenging things when we get into what is an external attachment, does it conform, does it not conform, all those things. A little bit more challenging than dealing with the rules themselves, taking relief from a cart path, things of that nature. The next section is amateur status. I know there's going to be some changes in that area. Those are ongoing. COVID-19 guidelines, I was going to delete that because I don't know if you've seen the news lately, but I think the pandemic's over. I think we're ready to move on, get rid of those masks, and let's live life. And that's kind of where I'm at. So no more COVID-19 guidelines. Let's get rid of those. Course marking. I probably should have put coordinate with the superintendent first, because it's really important at the club level that you have a good relationship with your golf course superintendent. And in many respects, the course marking, and everywhere is different. Sometimes the superintendent will do the course marking. In other cases, the golf professional and his staff. But however you sort that out as a team, you want to be ready to make sure that you have your golf course marked. In the Northeast, obviously, you're looking at getting it ready for April 1st when you can start posting scores and you start having club events. You want to be ready for the season. So what do you need? Well, yeah, of course, you need paint. In our world today with supply chain issues, you want to make sure that you get those things ordered and you have a supply of them depending on what you have on your golf course. Not as yellow paint is needed like the old days because things have, we see more red than we do yellow, but there's still a need for that depending on the nature of your penalty areas. So you want to have red and yellow for your penalty areas, obviously white for ground under repair, or maybe you use it to put to spot around your boundary stakes or what have you. Green paint. And why do you need green paint? Well, you know what? Every once in a while, it doesn't happen often, Clarkie will make a mistake and he'll have to use green paint to cover up a line that he put in the wrong place. Blue paint, maybe you use blue paint for near your scoring or starting areas. But again, good to have all these in your storage area. Paint guns, most of us use single guns. However, Parade has a great double gun now that you can put 2 cans of paint in there, and you can go out and just have to paint one time, put with 2 cans of paint, and you get a wonderful line, and you don't have to, and it'll stay for a while. So if you want to get a double gun, you can do that. Stakes, obviously red, yellow, white. We know what those are for. You want to have a mallet in case you're pounding stakes in, although the new stakes now have the spikes on the bottom. And unless you're dealing with a really firm area, you can just push those in by hand. Work gloves, again, you know, good because you can get splinters. A lot of things can happen to your hands. And in our profession, it's good to have work gloves and also shoes. If you're going out to paint the golf course, throw on some work shoes because many a shoe has been ruined by red and yellow paint or white paint. So good to put those work shoes on, have them in your office or in your locker, and you can put those shoes on when you go out and do your work on course. Each and every year, you know, look at your boundaries, make sure that your stakes, fences, things change through construction, whatever it might be, but you want to make sure that you look at and just ask yourself the question, are you properly marked and is everything buttoned up? No loose ends. You want to be bulletproof in terms of having, here's the playing field and you've got stakes, fences, etc., well defined, so there's no question of whether or not a ball is in or out of bounds. That's the last thing you want to have happen. Same thing with penalty areas. And as you know, in 2019, things changed to where it used to have to be a traditional water hazard, and to use the old terminology. But now, in the definition of penalty areas, we can include areas where if your ball were hit in there, it would be likely to be lost. And this could be a heavy wooded area. Let's say you're in the desert in Arizona. It could be where there's snakes and scorpions and what have you. So there are areas where you can make them into penalty areas if you want to. So it's important to look at that on your golf course, or if maybe you're a college coach and you're in charge of a competition, and you want to make sure that things are marked properly. Take a look at things. Should they be yellow? Should they be red? I know on our tour, we still mark penalty areas yellow in the traditional sense. You know, if you had an island green like at TPC at Sawgrass, at the stadium course, you're going to see number 12 at Augusta. There still are many courses that still use yellow paint, and in many cases they'll put dropping zones in. But depending on what's going on at your facility, you want to take a look at that. Should it be yellow? Should it be red? And then of course red areas. which is what we see more and more of now. But again, looking at these areas, you know, and the only thing I would say, if you're going to mark a wooded area as a penalty area, just be consistent throughout your golf course, because you wouldn't want to mark a wooded area on the second hole, a densely wooded area, and then later in the round, later on your course, on let's say the 16th hole, you have something that's very similar and you don't mark it as red. So I think you want to try to be consistent throughout your facility. Take a look at it, you know, from 20,000 feet. What's the best thing for your members and your customers, and then go ahead and mark it accordingly and do the best you can. And if you have questions, you know, you can always contact one of us. You can contact Brian or Jeffrey or somebody that can help you out and maybe give you some good advice. Model local rules. Again, looking at your golf course and figuring out which model local rules should you be enacting for your club. And I say that because unless you enact them, they're not in effect. You can't just assume that people that these model local rules are in effect. You have to post it somewhere at your club to make sure that your members know this. And we're going to talk a little bit about that, particularly when we get to Rule 4 with clubs, about damaged clubs. That model local rule, it's important that you enact that to allow your members and customers to replace clubs if they get damaged during the round. Otherwise, they can't. So big piece there with course marking. Excuse me. So some examples of model local rules, and these are all, again, in that official guide. They're all listed back there. And if you go on to the app, there is a section for model local rules. And if you go on the app too, you can access model local rules, and all of these options, along with many others, are back there. So clarifying when you have a wall or a road for a boundary. You can't just say the wall on number 4 is the boundary. Well, is it the inside of the wall? Is it beyond the wall? Very important to have it buttoned up to make sure that it's clear when a ball is in or out of bounds. If you have a boundary, a public road that runs through your golf course, like at Kennett Square, we used to have, well, we still have the roadway after number 2, you would cross the road to play 3 through 7. And we had that model local rule in effect that if a ball comes to rest, crosses the public road and comes to rest on another part of the course, it's out of bounds. And I think you're familiar with, there's plenty of places that have roads like this. So you want to just make sure, if you have this, that this information is posted on your notice or in your locker rooms or whatever you think the best way to communicate all of these model local rules. Opposite side of a red penalty area. This is really important because, as you probably are aware, in 19, we used to say the opposite margin was an option under when you hit your ball into a red penalty area. So you could drop within 2 club lengths of where it last crossed, or you could go to the opposite margin equidistant from the hole. Well, now that opposite side option is only available if you enact it as a committee. Otherwise, it's not available. And a good example of that is, for example, number 13 at Augusta, Rays Creek on the left-hand side, they have this model local rule in effect for hole number 13. And they'll be specific. I think it's 2 and 8 and 13. They still allow opposite side relief for red penalty areas. All the other red penalty areas, it's not available. So you want to take a look at your golf course and see, are there any red penalty areas where you want to give the opposite side relief? Because I think Rays Creek at number 13, since we're all familiar with that, if a player hit it left trying to cut the corner and the ball went in the left side, not on the fairway side, but on the left, as you're playing the hole on the left side of that red penalty area, they could be dropping in azalea bushes or in the middle of trees. And they are paying a penalty stroke. So I think the committee feels like, you know what, Let's let them come out on the opposite side. They're paying a penalty stroke, and we think that's enough. So that type of philosophy is important as you look at your golf course and decide whether or not you want to allow opposite side relief. And then you would just list whatever holes you think that's appropriate. If you don't have any, you don't have to say anything, because that option is not available unless you as a committee enact it. So really important. This D7, limiting us when a stroke is made from the putting green must be replayed. And this exception, this really came about on the Champions Tour. We had Jesper Parnevik go to tap a putt in, and the ball it lipped out and hit him in the foot. And then he tapped it in. And it happened on the third hole. He didn't say anything until he got in scoring. And the way the rule reads, without this local rule, that stroke is canceled and he has to replay it. So essentially, he ended up getting a wrong place penalty. But interestingly enough, his tap in, his original stroke that hit him in the foot didn't count. So it becomes a bit of an accounting nightmare. Same thing with a stroke from the putting green that hits a animal that is defined as a loose impediment, like a worm or an insect. You might remember the deal with Paul Casey, European Tour, where his putt hit a bug on the putting green, and they didn't know they were debating whether or not it did hit the bug. The good news is, with this local rule in effect, it's important to have that on your sheets, so that if one of your members in the club championship hits a putt and the ball hits a worm or a insect on the putting green, we're not canceling and replaying the stroke. We're going to count the stroke and play it as a lie. So D7 is important. Every association I know of has that on their hard cards for their competition. So at the club level, this is certainly one that you want to have. Dropping zones, important to look that one up. Preferred lies, there is a recommended language from the USGA for preferred lies. Important to have that. Back on the line relief, there's some, this came out, I think, within 3 months after the new code came out in 19, that there was some potential problems with the way the rule was worded. So they came up with this local rule, model local rule, E12, and you should have this on your sheet as well. Very, very important. So that if a player didn't pick a reference point and the ball rolled forward, as long as it didn't roll more than a club length and they play it, they're not going to get a penalty. So really important to make sure that you understand that and have that on your hard card at your club, on your notice. Immovable obstructions close to the putting green. Over on the other side of the pond, they use this all the time. And now in the tours, we have this on our hard card for all of our competitions. We call it 2 and 2, meaning that if the obstruction is within 2 club lengths of the putting green and your ball is within 2 club lengths of the obstruction, we are now going to give line of play relief. Whereas if you didn't have this local rule in effect, you wouldn't get relief for line of play, only for the normal live ball, stance, area of intended swing, and only on the putting green would you get relief for line of play. So one of those things where you want to look at your golf course, is it prevalent? If it's only on 1 or 2 holes, I don't think I would enact this local rule, but that's your call. You can also, what the tours do is we actually modify it a little bit and say that both the obstruction and your ball has to be in an area, in the general area mode at fairway height or less. So if your ball was in the rough and the sprinkler head was on the apron on your line of play, you would not get relief. So both the ball and the obstruction have to be in a area of fairway height or less. So we basically modify it for that, and the local rule allows you to do that. And if you are going to enact it, I would definitely do that. I would, and I think that may be helpful. It is a bit, there are some nuances to this that make it a little bit confusing. But again, you have to look at your golf course and decide, okay, are there a lot of shots where your members or your customers need to play them across along the ground, and that it would be a good thing. And you have to, again, if it's only an odd case here or there, I would not put it in effect. But if it's prevalent, you certainly at your disposal to add to your hard card. Sod seams, everybody has that on their hard card, but unless you put it on there, it's not in effect. And essentially, we give relief for the lie of the ball and the area of intended swing. We don't give it for stance only, but that's typical on all the hard cards for all the associations across the country. So important to make sure you add that. And then G9, we're going to talk about in a minute about replacement of a club that's broken or significantly damaged. We'll talk about that more in depth as we go through Rule 4. I've mentioned the word hard card, and keep in mind your hard card is one thing, and then your notice to the players is another. Here's an example of our hard card for the PGA Tour Champions for 2022, and we have these are at our starters boxes all over the place in our office, and those are in effect, all the local rules that are in effect for all of our competitions, where we prohibit distance measuring devices, transportation, sod seams, obstructions close to the putting green, all those things we list on there. We have the TIO local rule information on there. So that's what we mean by a hard card. And then your notice is specific to that event. We'll talk about that in a moment. But the hard card, and everybody has one of these. At Kennett Square, what I used to have is an 8.5 by 11 piece of paper that I called our hard card. And it was everything that was in effect for every club event. And I'm sure Ryan probably has that still in his computer and uses it. But you should do the same thing too. That way you don't have to redo it for every event. And then I used to put the notice on the opposite side of it when we printed for a tournament. So we'd have the notice on one side, hard card on the other. And I think the section does something similar to that. And you should be familiar with the sections hard card. You know, it's on the website. You can take a look at it, print it out, read through it, make sure you're familiar with it. Might save you someday from getting a penalty or doing something that you shouldn't be doing. The format, the verbiage, the logos, you can do something at the club level that's kind of fun, and make sure that that the presentation is good. Make sure the formatting is good. Make sure the verbiage is correct. If you haven't put your club logo on there, that's a good thing. And again, this hard card works hand in hand with your notice to the players. Those two things, they work together. Notice to the players, we mentioned that. And again, here you're going to put the event name, the date, and these are specific to the competition. Things that you want to put on there, and everyone is a little bit different. You're going to put your format, your tees, handicap allowance, how your teeing area and scoring area is defined, how you're going to break ties, really important. What are the playoff holes? All this stuff is on your notice, and this is dynamic based on the event that you're having. So important to have all that information organized properly. And you can do all this. I know, and Ryan would we used to have a file for every tournament at the club, and we would have the notice from the previous year. And when I went in to prepare for the season for the upcoming events, we would just have it all updated and ready to go in the file. All we had to do is print them up, and you can do all this in the off season to get yourself ready, especially if you have the same events year in, year out. Newer events, you have to kind of look at that and see and tweak it accordingly for the details of a new event. But all these things should be spelled out on your notice, especially how to break ties. Gosh, you just don't want to be standing there at an event and have a tie and say, okay, pro, how are we going to break the tie? And you don't have it spelled out, because someone's going to be disappointed. Someone's going to be happy. Someone's going to be upset. But you can take care of all of that by putting it right on your notice in advance. Starting and scoring. These areas, like I said, at PGA of America, we always put some of our top officials in these areas because it is important, because we can save somebody from being disqualified. And you want to define these areas. You can either use ropes, you can use paint, a lot of ways to do it, but it's up to you. You could say that, like in Square, our lower patio in the 19th hole, that was the scoring area. We gave a generous area to define the scoring area. But again, you have to figure out how do you want to handle that at your facility. If you have a big shotgun event where you have a lot of people coming in, obviously a larger area is better because you don't want people turning in a scorecard, leaving the scoring area, and then they come back and they say, "Hey, pro, I think I made a mistake on the card." Well, have they left a scoring area or not? If you don't have it defined, well, then you've got a potential problem. Staging, in our world today, you got Bobby Pollitt and the products that he makes with the starters boxes and the tablecloths with logos and chair and umbrella signage. We are the professionals of the game, so why not make your first tee at the club for your club championship? Why not make it look like a true first tee for a major championship? And depending on how far you want to go, you can make it look really nice, and your members will notice that. And so it's all out there available to you, and certainly the staging is important. Supplies, obviously, pairing sheets, pencils, reading glasses for the old guys and gals, phone numbers for tee times, tees on the teeing area, Sharpies, ball markers. All those things are really important to have at your tee, as well as refreshments. Having a cooler with particularly near your scoring area. But all those things make a difference, and your members do notice it. So I think it would be a good thing to just take a look at how you're doing things. Is there anything you can do differently in 2022 that can, not reinventing the wheel, but reinventing yourself so that your members will come out, say, boy, they really did a nice job upgrading the staging of our tournaments. And you can get some recognition from your members or customers by doing a good job in that area. I'm sure many of you do anyway, but always good to look at it and see, is there any things you can do better, and go ahead and try to implement them if you can. So that's what I've got in this presentation. While I'm switching over, do we have any questions from anybody?
There haven't been any submitted yet, Tom.
How about that? All right. All right, what's going on here? All right, man, I'm having some trouble here. Let me see if I can switch this over. What I need is Clarky to, his technical expertise. He's so good at this stuff.
Well, I was just going to say I'm quite perturbed by the hiatus here between your first presentation and Rule 4. Hope you get it straightened out.
Well, I'm trying to.
I know.
Tom, while you're doing that, I just wanted to echo your sentiments and thank you, Clarky, for chairing this committee for so long. And yes, I am taking over as chair, but only because Clarky agreed not to leave or go anyplace. So he will still be here. And the other thing I'd like to mention, give a shout out to Ben Debsky. He was at Tom's Rules Workshop up at Far Hills, and he scored above that 90 mark. So congratulations to Ben. And Tom, your instruction was effective, obviously.
Awesome. Thanks, Alice. Yeah, I'm happy for Ben. I know he's worked hard at it. And again, I know, and I think certainly Alice, Jeff, and Clarky would agree with me. the service on our National Rules Committee has been just absolutely one of the best things ever. If anybody has an interest, again, you just go to a rules workshop, pay close attention, take the test at the end, get your score, get your experience, and then we can get your name in front of myself or Alice or Jeff, and we can forward it on to the chairman of the National Committee, who's Chip Essig. He's the new chairman as of November at the annual meeting. So really important. All right,
Tom,
so now
sorry, before you get started, we see your presenter view, so the slideshow isn't full screen right now.
Oh. Doggone it. I wanted to. All right, let me. All right, I'll just have to go without it then. Yeah.
There you go.
I got to have my laser pointer. Got to have that, right, Clarky? Okay.
Absolutely.
So rule 4. Let's see where we are here now. It's quarter up. So that was pretty good. We got that done in about 40 minutes after Clarky's song and a few announcements. So now we're going to jump into, I think, the main thrust of today's webinar is Rule 4, which talks about the player's equipment. And we have 3 sections under this rule. We're going to talk about clubs, golf balls, and then this 4.3 section, which is pretty scary when it comes to all this use of equipment and the equipment rules. But we've got some good examples of there, what you're allowed to do, what you're not allowed to do. And hopefully at the end of that, you'll have a better understanding going forward. So again, we're going to talk about what clubs are allowed, what clubs are not allowed, conforming versus non-conforming. What happens if a club is damaged during the round? What about changing playing characteristics? And you're going to see that there's a difference between normal use and changing them deliberately. And we'll talk about that. Obviously, we know that 14 is the magic number. We'll talk about the number of clubs and the penalty statement for that, which is a little bit different than any other rule. This model local rule G9, which I mentioned, should be on all of your hard cards at your club, at the club level, and procedure for taking a club out of play. Golf balls, conformity. What if a ball breaks into pieces? What if it's cut or cracked during a hole? We'll talk about that. And then, of course, this use of other equipment under 4.3. So those are our 3 sections that we're going to talk about. The main thrust here is that the rules of golf, they want you to use your judgment, your skill, and your ability to play the game. And we don't want to give you equipment that's going to circumvent those 3 areas. We want you to use those to play the game. We want you to use conforming balls and clubs. We want to limit you to 14 clubs. And normally you cannot replace a club that is damaged. You're going to hear me use the expression default, because there's the default, which is what's in the rule book, and then a model local rule, this G9, is going to then modify that and allow players to replace clubs where if you didn't have that model local rule in effect, they couldn't replace them. And we'll talk a little bit about that. And then this restricted use of other equipment. So here we have the equipment rules, as I mentioned. If you go into the USGA's website, there's a PDF file that you can download onto your computer, and probably wouldn't be a bad idea to print a couple of those out and have them hanging around your golf shop near your official guide and rule book, etc. And these are regulations for clubs, balls, other equipment, very detailed. If you're having trouble sleeping, it is great for insomnia. Start reading the equipment rules, and I guarantee you'll be asleep before you get halfway through it. But you can find it on the USGA's website. Great resource. Dive right into clubs. We're going to have 3 sections here. And 4.1, we're going to talk about clubs allowed to make a stroke. our limit of 14. And then what's the procedure for taking a club out of play when we have to? I'm going to skip by that question. We'll come back to that at the end. So first part, clubs allowed in making a stroke. Obviously, we have to have conforming clubs. What do we do when a club is damaged? Can we use it? Can we repair it? We'll go into that in the second section. And then the last part is changing clubs' performance characteristics during the round, deliberately versus just through normal wear and tear. So let's talk about, obviously, we have to use clubs that conform to the equipment rules. And there's a lot of different clubs that get sent to USGA to look at. Do they conform? Do they not conform? A lot of technology out there. So really important to make sure all the manufacturers, the major ones that we, and I say we, all of us, that we get our equipment from, you can be sure that the major manufacturers are up to speed on this, and that the equipment you're ordering for your members and for yourself, they do conform to the equipment rules. But occasionally you'll come across some gimmick that's on TV, and you want to make sure that it does conform. And again, a club used to make a stroke must conform when it's new, but it also has to conform when it's been deliberately or accidentally changed in any way. So it must conform when it's new, and also after you deliberately or accidentally changed it in any way. But if performance characteristics changed, we have this exception that says it's okay if they change through wear through normal use. What do we mean by that? Well, you see Ben Hogan's 1-iron over there in the picture. It means through a stroke, practice strokes or practice swings, removing the club in and out of your golf bag. In particular, with Hogan's club there, you can see we're saying a depression on the face. So it's really strange to me that where that mark is, where he was hitting the club on those, I mean, where it's inside, pretty interesting that is where he, now granted his club came from the inside and he trapped it, but that's where his mark was, and that was normal wear, and that club would conform, even though it might have a depression because he hit so many golf balls with it that he created this depression on the face of the club. But all this normal use, this interpretation just clarifies what do we mean by normal use. In this rule, we have what we call an internal definition. What do we mean by performance characteristics? And we're talking about what affects how the club performs during a stroke. And we're really talking about the grip, the shaft, the club head, loft, and lie. And of course, in our world today, we have a lot of clubs that are adjustable. So loft and lie is certainly an important element to this internal definition. So when we talk about our performance characteristics being changed, this is what we're referring to: grip, shaft, club head, lie, or loft. So what happens if during the round a club is damaged? And what do we say? Again, this is the default. This is, if you put the local rule in effect, you'll see we have different options. But if you have not enacted it, a player normally must not replace it with another club. And the same thing while play is stopped. So let's watch this video of Ernie here. Now, we do have one exception. If the player didn't cause the damage, and we'll talk about that by an outside influence, natural forces, some other person.
Get up. Sit there. Well worth it. Wow, that's dangerous.
He wasn't holding back, Peter.
Oh, no, he wasn't. And he hit a pretty good shot.
Yeah, that's a
Thomas
great.
Peters struggled yesterday. Wow.
That looked like Clarkie in his younger days. He could just snap a club in half. But again, in those cases right there, the default rule would be that neither Ernie or Thomas Peters could replace those clubs under the default rule. Now, when we put G9 in effect, we'll talk about that Ernie's going to have an option. Thomas Peters, because his was done with abuse, he wouldn't have the option. And this is kind of like what the rule was before 2019. No matter what, the key element here is no matter what the damage was, both Peters or Els, that club is treated as conforming for the rest of the round. So this club right over here, you can see a club has to have a head and a shaft, right? So even though the club was broken, this piece right here with the head and this piece of the shaft, that is treated as a conforming club for the remainder of the round. The part with the grip on it, with just the shaft, that's not a club anymore. So that you can't use that. But this you could if you wanted to for the remainder of the round. Keep in mind that in stroke play, when you have a playoff, that's a separate new round. So if, for example, you had a club that got bent during the round and it had a significant bend in it, and you finished the round with it, and you were in a playoff, you would have to make sure you didn't start the playoff and use that club that is bent, because that club would no longer be conforming. So really important to make sure that the distinction between, if I damage a club during the round, even if it's now non-conforming, I can use it for the rest of the round. But then once that round is over with, then I've got to either repair it or get rid of it and substitute it with a conforming club. So very important in that respect. So again, this player, in this case right here, both Ernie and Thomas Peters, they can use that damaged club. They can continue to make strokes with it if they want to. They can have it repaired. Again, this is the default. Now, the only thing here is the repairing, we're dealing with the same grip, the same shaft, and the same club head when we talk about repairing this club if it's damaged during the round or while play is stopped. So again, the original grip, shaft, club head must be used when we're repairing it. And what we meaning by repair, and this is an important element here, lead tape. You know, if you had lead tape that fell off during the round, you can put the tape back on. Because of the nature of lead tape, a lot of times it won't stay on. You can take a new piece. But again, it wouldn't mean that you could now say, you know what, I'm going to add 3 pieces of lead tape because I really want more weight. Now we're changing the playing characteristics. When we say repair, we mean restore, put it back the way it was, no better, no worse, as close as possible. So if you had one 1-inch piece of lead tape on the back of the club and it fell off, you can put that piece back on. If it won't stay, you can take a new piece of tape, 1 inch, and put that in the same place on the club as close as possible in the same location, so you're not changing the playing characteristics of the club. Same thing if during the round, and we see this happen quite a bit, you know, the club head comes loose. Can you take the wrench out and tighten it up? Absolutely, you can. A weight in the port comes loose. Can you tighten up the weight in the port? Yes, you can. You just could not put a different weight of in the port. You've got to use that same weight, put it in there, and you can go ahead and repair it if you want. Some restrictions here. Obviously, you can't unreasonably delay play, and this is important. Any damage that existed before the round must not be repaired. Well, what do we mean by this? So let's suppose you have 1 piece of lead tape on all of your irons, and you're on the range, and you're hitting 7 irons, and that piece of lead tape falls off your 7-iron before the round. So you start the round and you get out on the golf course, and the first time you pull that 7-iron out, you realize that, oh my, I damaged this on the range before, can I add a piece of lead tape? And the answer is no. You started the round. That damage was before the round, not during the round. There is a difference. So you could not repair it and put tape on your 7-iron. That's what we mean by before the round. Once again, we have this internal definition of damage during the round. What do we mean by that? It's any act during the round, and it would be, by the player. It could mean a stroke, a practice swing, taking the club in and out of your bag, dropping it or leaning on it, throwing it or abusing it, and then, of course, by any other person, outside influence, or natural forces. That would all be considered damage during the round. But a club is not damaged during the round if you deliberately change the playing characteristics. This picture right here, you see this player, maybe it's windy out and they decide they want to knock the loft down a little bit to hit it a little bit lower. That's not damage during the round. This player is deliberately changing the playing characteristics, and we're going to cover that in just a moment. And you'll see that this player is not entitled to do this. And if they went ahead and did it and made a stroke with that club, that they would be disqualified. We'll talk about that in just a moment. On to this G9 local rule, and everybody on this call, all your friends, everybody should have this on your hard card at your club, because now what we're doing is expanding the ability for a player who club that is broken or significantly damaged, except for abuse, anger. We're going to let the player replace the club. So in Ernie Els's case, whatever club he used, he could add a club to his 14 to his set for that round after he broke that club just by making a stroke at it. In Thomas Peters' case, he could not replace because he did it through abuse. So what do we mean by broken or significantly damaged? We talk about a shaft that breaks into pieces, a shaft that's bent. If you have a little dent in the shaft, just that dent in of itself does not make the club significantly damaged or broken. So you couldn't replace it if it just had a little dent in it, a little ding, if you will. Club face impact area is visibly deformed, not a scratch, and we're talking about deformed. Club head is visibly significantly deformed. Club head is detached or loose from the shaft. Let's say you with the driver, and for some reason you can't get the head to tighten. Well, we would allow you then to go ahead and replace the club. The grip is loose. In this case here, you could replace the club if you wanted to. There is an exception here that's important, that just because the face or head of a driver is cracked does not mean you can go ahead and replace it. You can have a hairline crack that's visible that would not be allowed to be replaced because it's not deformed. Semantics, so to speak, but what we're talking about here is if you were to rub your hand over this crack, would you feel, is there a gap, if you will? Is there a hole, a gap between the metal? Is the metal folding in on itself? It has to be significant, but just a crack in of itself does not mean you can replace it. So you want to be careful of that when you have this local rule in effect. But everybody should have it, because it is, in the case of the Ernie Els video, if you didn't have this local rule in effect and you have a player at your club that makes a swing and they hit a shot like that and the shaft breaks, they cannot replace it. And I think we all would agree that you should be able to. Again, when you're replacing the club, you must immediately take it out of play. We're going to talk about those procedures in just a moment. And so here we're talking about this third section here about making a stroke with a club whose performance characteristics were deliberately changed. So again, must not make a stroke with the club that's been changed, or by using an adjustable feature to physically change the club. And we see this person here in this picture got their wrench out there, or by applying any substance to the club head. You know, you want to put a little grease on there or salve because it's going to take away some of the spin and you'll get more distance. Interestingly enough, when you apply a substance to the face of a club for how it performs, you cannot wipe it off and undo this. Once you put substance on the face to affect how it performs, that club is no longer, you cannot make a stroke at it. And even if you think you got it all off by cleaning it, you cannot use that club. So, which goes back to what this says, don't apply any substance to the club head to affect how it performs. You can avoid the whole problem altogether. Now, we do have one exception here. I just mentioned that if you put a substance on the face of the club, that you cannot undo it. In the case where you took your wrench out and you changed the loft or the lie, and before you made a stroke at it, you realize that you made a mistake. Well, we're going to let you adjust it back to the way it was without penalty, and then you're able to use that club for the round. So again, if you adjust it and then realize it before you make a stroke at it, you can put it back the way it was, no better, no worse, and put it back the way it was, no penalty, and go ahead and use that club for the round. That would be okay. So again, one of the key elements here is the trigger point for the penalty under this rule is when you make a stroke with a non-conforming club, with a club where you deliberately change the playing characteristics. That's what triggers the penalty, and the penalty is severe. It's a disqualification penalty for making a stroke in this case. There is no penalty for carrying this non-conforming club in your bag, or if you added a substance to the face and you realize that you were not allowed to do that, you can keep the club, and just by carrying it is not a penalty. The penalty is triggered by when you use it for a stroke. That's counted for the round. Same thing with change performance characteristics. Again, carrying the club is not a penalty. Using it triggers the disqualification penalty. It still counts as one of your 14 clubs, but again, make sure the main thing is not to make a stroke at it. Limit of 14 clubs. I think we're all familiar with this. We're not allowed to share. The default here is no replacing lost or damaged clubs, with the exception of when we have the local rule G9 in effect, and restrictions when we're adding or replacing clubs. So here we go. A player must not start a round with more than 14 or have more than 14 during the round. So before you go to the tee, and if you have a starter, not a bad idea to have your starter, if you have a club event, to just say to the players, hey, folks, make sure you count your clubs. 14 is the magic number, and to make sure you don't have any problems with your event. Now, if a player starts with fewer than 14, which is okay, I can start with 10 if I want, you can add clubs during the round to get up to 14, as long as you don't exceed the limit of 14. So if I have, in our world today, usually someone's going to have, probably 13 might be an example. Most people are around that 14. But if you have 13 clubs and you want to add an extra wedge, or maybe the driver's not working, go ahead and add one club to get the 14, and that would be okay. Now, there are some restrictions about where you can get this club. For example, you couldn't get it from anybody playing on the course. We'll talk about that in just a moment, about that restriction. Interesting interpretation here. So again, this 14 club limit, it applies, I'm going to read this, to any clubs being carried by the player, we know that, or any other person he or she asked to carry clubs. So we have this example here. Player begins with 10, and they ask this person to carry 8 additional clubs. And the player is intending on adding during the round. And all this interpretation is saying, if you did this, we're not going to let you circumvent the rule. For the purpose of this rule, if you ask somebody to carry these 8 clubs, well, now you're going to be considered to be carrying 18 clubs, and you'll be in violation of the rule. So, and this actually happened. It's a one-off, probably will not happen to any of us, but if it did come up, we have this interpretation that will clarify it. So in the case where a player becomes aware that they've got more than 14, they've violated this rule, the player must immediately take the SS clubs out of play. So you must react to this breach right away. And that means before you make any other strokes here, you got to just take care of the situation, and we need to take clubs out of play. So there's 2 different ways. So if you started with more than 14, let's say you started with 16 clubs. Well, when you look at your set, you can take any 2 clubs and take them out of play. Doesn't matter which 2. Any 2 will do and get you back to 14, and then you play on, and you've complied with the rule. You're going to get the penalty, but that's what you must do. Now, if you started the round with 14 and then you added clubs during the round, usually this would be probably you added 1 club. You went to your locker and got an extra putter at the turn, and you added this club during the round, and then you realized it was a breach. Well, the clubs that you added that put you over the 14, those are the clubs that you have to take out of play. So again, if you start the round with more than 14, you can take any club out of play to get back to 14. If you add clubs during the round and go over the 14, those added clubs are the ones that you have to take out. Key distinction there. So we do have some exceptions here. So if you started with 14, you're in compliance with the rule, and you find a club on the golf course that the group in front of you left behind, you can go ahead and put it in your bag and pick it up as a courtesy. And you're not going to be, it's not treated if you had 14. The main thing here, obviously, you don't want to make sure you don't make a stroke at it. So if it happens to be the same kind of club that you play with, just be really careful. But we want players to pick up clubs that someone left behind. We don't want to leave them out there. As a courtesy to our fellow players, go ahead and pick it up and then see if you can't get it back to that player that left it behind to help out. Same thing if somebody inadvertently puts a club in your bag instead of their own, that's not a breach of the rule. Now, again, we want to make sure you don't use that club, because then you're going to have problems. You want to make sure that doesn't happen. Again, let's talk. There's no sharing of clubs. You're limited to the clubs that you started with or added. So you must not make a stroke with a club being used by anyone else on the course. When you become aware of this with this other club, you must immediately take that club out of play and get back to your 14. If that club belonged to another player, obviously that player can get that club back. But again, if you make a stroke at it, that's where the problem is. And in team events, again, you can share clubs as long as the total number of clubs between you doesn't exceed 14. We don't see this very often, but if you wanted to, you could do that. So if a player started with 14, if you lose or damage a club during the round or while play is stopped, you must not replace it with another club. And the losing a club, we know that that's in effect no matter whether the local rule's in effect or not. The damaged club will allow you, if you have that local rule in effect, will give you a little bit more leeway to replace. But in any case, we have this exception about if the player did not cause the damage during the round, meaning that this damage was by an outside influence, by natural forces. Let's say the wind blew and a big branch fell off a tree, hit your golf bag, and broke your driver. Well, we're going to say that's by natural forces. So we're going to let you replace that club if it's damaged because of what happened. It was out of your control, so to speak. Same thing if it was by any other person. other than the player or his caddy. So we do have this exception in place, even if you did not enact G9. If in these cases here, if the player did not cause the damage, in these three cases here, we're going to let the player go ahead and replace the damaged club. Obviously, if we have G9 in place, again, with the exception of abuse or anger, a player would be allowed to replace the club if it was significantly damaged or broken. And again, you can replace a damaged club with any club. So if I break my 7-iron and I'm allowed to replace it, I can add another wedge or I can add a putter. I'm not restricted with what club I'm going to add when I'm allowed to replace. So that's a key point there. And when you do this, the player must immediately take the damaged club out of play, and then you're replacing it with a new club. Keep in mind that that club, obviously you cannot make any more strokes with that club that you've taken out of play, or else you would be in breach of the rule. Okay, we cannot unreasonably delay play. That's important. We cannot add or borrow a club from anyone who's playing on the course. So there is some restriction about where you're going to be able to get this club. You cannot build a club from components that are carried by anyone for the player. So let's suppose you have an extra driver head in the pocket of your golf bag, and your club head becomes deformed, and you're allowed to replace it. You cannot take that club head out of your bag and use it to replace it. Okay, we're not going to let you circumvent the rule in the world of components. So these components would have to come from off the course. You may remember the ruling with Bryson DeChambeau at Harding Park when he hit a tee shot on the 7th hole and he leaned down and the shaft broke from his driver, and he called me for a ruling, and basically he had another shaft in his car, and he asked, could we go get it for him? So I drove one of the people from his team out to the parking lot, grabbed the shaft, came back out, and he was able to put that shaft in the with the head of his club and do it right there on the spot. If he happened to have an extra shaft in his bag that he brought, said, yeah, I break shafts all the time, so I always carry extra shafts in case it breaks. Well, then he could not use that if it broke during the round or while play was stopped. So a key element there about components. So let's talk about our penalty statement here. This is kind of very different, and we want to make sure that everybody understands what happens here. So what happens if you become aware of the breach while you're playing the hole, or whether you're between holes, and we're going to talk about that. So while playing a hole, the penalty is applied at the end of the hole. So this player, right in the middle of the hole, she realizes, oh, I've got 15 clubs in my bag, and that's going to be a problem. So in match play, the player is going to complete the hole, apply the result of that hole to the match score, and then apply the penalty. In simple terms, what you're going to do when you identify a breach while you're playing a hole, you're going to finish the hole based on your talent and then adjust the match accordingly. 1 hole for each hole which the breach occurred, maximum of 2. So we'll give you an example in just a moment. If it happens between the play of 2 holes, the penalty is going to be applied as of the end of the hole just completed, not the next hole. So we're on the way from the 9th hole to the 10th hole. We realize the breach. Well, the penalty is going to be applied at the end of the 9th hole in between holes. So again, here in match play, we're going to deduct 1 hole for each hole which the breach occurred, maximum of 2. And again, it's an adjustment to the match. So if Clarky and I are playing and we start the first hole, we're walking down to our tee shots, and Clarky realizes, oh, Tom, I made a mistake. I've got 50. I forgot to take this extra driver out of my bag, and he's got 15. Well, the answer is not, well, okay, Clarky, you lose the hole. Let's go to number 2. That's not the answer. The answer is we are going to finish the first hole, and then adjust the match by 1. So in our case here on the first hole, let me go back for a second here. So if I won the first hole, we would go to the second tee. We would adjust the match by 1. I would be 2 up, and we'll have only played 1 hole. If we halved the hole, tied the hole, well, then I would be 1 up. If I lost the hole, well, now we would be all square. We would be tied. So again, we're going to finish the hole based on talent, and then it's an adjustment to the match. Very key point in a match play setting. Very easy to make a mistake with this when you're applying the penalty in match play. So again, 1 hole for each hole which the breach happened in, maximum of 2. Here's our example. Player started with 15 clubs. They become aware of the breach while playing the 3rd hole, and then they win that hole to go 3 up in the match. Well, now we've played 3 holes, so this will be a 2-hole adjustment, and now this player would be 1 up. So very, very important. It's right in the rule book now. Stroke play, a little different scenario because we have some accounting. Remember, we're going to get 2 penalty strokes for each hole which the breach occurred, maximum of 4, and we have to make sure that those penalty strokes get added in the proper place on the scorecard, because now we have that accounting in the scoring area that we have to make sure gets squared away properly. So again, 2 strokes for each hole which the breach occurred, maximum of 4, and they're going to be on the first 2 holes of where the breach occurred. So in the case where the player, let me go back for a second here, player realizes they got too many clubs and they're on the 3rd hole, well, they would add 2 penalty strokes to the first hole, 2 penalty strokes to the second hole. If it was a 1st and 10th tee start and I started on the 10th hole and I realized it while I'm playing number 12, the penalty strokes would be added to hole number 10 and hole number 11. If it was a shotgun and I started on 15 and I realized the breach on 18, I would go back and make sure my penalty strokes were on hole number 15 and hole number 16. Again, the first 2 holes that you played, that's where you would put the penalty strokes. Very, very important that if this happens, and if it were me, I would just say to whoever's in scoring, hey, look, this happened. Help me out. I'm going to make sure I get my penalty strokes put in the right place, and that committee member who is in scoring can help you with that. Very important. All right, so now we've got a breach. How do we take clubs out of play during the round or before a round? 2 different sections here. During the round, again, here you've made a stroke. So you violated the limit of 14, or you shared clubs, or you replaced a club when you were not allowed to. In all those cases, you've got to take an immediate action to fix your mistake, to fix the breach. You're still going to get a penalty, but you have an obligation to immediately rectify this breach. So you're going to take each and you're going to need to take these clubs out of play. And you've clearly indicated this so that now this player over here, this player, I'm taking my 7 wood out of play right here. So this player, and he's declaring this to his opponent in a match play setting, marker, or another player in the group in stroke play. So this is one way that you can declare this club out of play. Another way is taking a clear action, such as turning the club upside down, putting the club on the floor of the cart, or in the basket of the cart, or giving it to another person. So you can declare it to somebody in your group, your opponent match play, or you can take this clear action, and that would suffice in the case of this rule in getting back to 14 clubs. But you must not make a stroke for the rest of the round with any club taken out of play. So, and if you do, your breach here would be a disqualification. Or if you notice the breach and you don't take any immediate action, that also triggers the disqualification penalty. If this club that you used in breach of the rule belonged to somebody else, well, that other player can get that club back. That question always comes up. They can get that club back. Now, This part of the rule is many times misinterpreted and interpreted to be more lenient than it actually is. It is really a very narrow case where, let's read what it says. If a player becomes aware shortly before starting a round, shortly before means, I mean, they're on the tee. It's time. They're getting ready to start the round, and then he or she accidentally has more than 14 clubs. It's accidental, folks. It's not deliberate. They've come to the tee. They had no idea that they had that extra putter or driver in their bag. It's an accident. And so what should this player do? Well, they should try to leave the excess club behind. That's one that fixes it for sure. And again, this is accidental. The other thing that we're going to let them do is they can declare this club out of play, just like we talked about a moment ago, using that procedure, either by making a statement to your marker, your opponent in match play, your marker in stroke play, or another person in your group, or by taking a deliberate action. But again, this is an accident, totally an honest mistake. You get to the tee, oh, I forgot it. I didn't take that extra club out. And this would be a case, let's suppose you have a shotgun and you're starting at the far reaches of the golf course. Are we going to now say that this player needs to get rid of a club? Well, that's not practical. So they could just say to somebody, hey, look, I forgot to take this driver out. I'm going to turn it upside down. I'm going to put it in the basket of the cart, and I'm going to declare it out of play. And in this very narrow case, there would be no penalty. There would be no penalty. Again, but you must not use that club. If you did this, you must not use the club. Interestingly enough, if let's say this extra club was a driver in the example I gave you, and I put it in the basket of the cart, I told Clarky it was an accident. He agreed, there's no penalty. During the round, I break my driver. Well, this does not allow me to add that driver that I declared out of play. I've got to get a different driver. I cannot take advantage of this rule because I had this extra club in the basket of the cart. I declared this club out of play. So again, club taken out of play, it must not be used for the remainder of the round. This is a clarification that came about. Again, these clarifications are an extension of the rule, and they were written after all the printed materials were made in January of 2019. But they are in a separate document, a PDF file, and you want to print these out and have them with your rule book and your information in your golf shop or your office. Okay, now we talked about this was an accident. What if the player deliberately did this? They brought more than 14 clubs to the tee or out to the 15th tee where they were starting, and they didn't leave it behind. Well, then they would be in breach of the rule. So again, this is a very narrow case where it's an honest mistake, it's an accident, but if it's done deliberately, and it's more than shortly before the round, because again, that language said shortly before the round, and by accident, they had this extra club. But if it was done deliberately or more than shortly, they need to leave a club behind to get back to 14 before the round, or they're going to have a problem. All right, so we have a question here. Let's read through this. In which one of the following circumstances is a player not required to take a club out of play? So let's say answer A, when the player discovers he started his round with more than 14. I think we all would agree that this player now has to do what? They started the round with more than 14, and now in this case, they can take any club. So if they started with 16, they can take any 2 clubs. They must declare them out of play and not use them for the remainder of the round. And they get the penalty. So we know that that's not correct. B, when the player who started his round with 14, he switches putters after 9 and starts the 10th hole and realizes he was not allowed to switch putters. So this player during the round added another club in breach of the rule, and they started the 10th hole. Well, now they're going to get the penalty, And now in this case, the club that they have to declare out of play is the added putter that they put in their bag when they made the turn. It's not any club. They must take that club that they added, and that's the putter in this case that they have to take out of play. So we know that that's not correct. Let's see C. After the player deliberately changed playing characteristics of one of his clubs during the round, even though he hasn't used it since he changed it. Remember what we said. I changed the loft on my driver, knocked the loft down because it's windy. As long as I don't make a stroke with that club, I've not breached the rule. And in that rule, it didn't say anything about taking it out of play. All it did say was that I can carry it with me, and as long as I don't use it, it's not a penalty, and it does count towards my 14. So it looks like this is the answer. And this also in the case, we know that if I change the loft, that I can do what? These adjustable clubs, if I adjust it back to what it was, to the same loft as it was before, I can then use that club. In the case of adding substance to the face of the club, I cannot undo that. I don't have to declare that club out of play. I just can't use it. It might be a good idea to make that club put the club in a certain place or turn it upside down so I don't make the mistake of using it if I realize my error. But I don't have to declare it out of play. So it looks like C is the answer. Let's read the last one here. After realizing he used another player's club by mistake to make a stroke. So we have sharing clubs here. And again, we said in the rule that you must declare that club out of play immediately. So it looks like answer C is our answer under this rule. All right. Any questions under this section, under clubs?
Tom, I've got a question.
Go ahead.
Sure.
Okay, we're talking about too many clubs. So on the fourth hole, I incurred the 2-stroke penalty, and I'm not sure when I turn my score in, I should have put that 2-stroke penalty on the first hole, but I don't. Is the exception to what is it, 3-3? Is that going to get me off, or am I going to be disqualified?
Oh, that's a great question. So the scorecard. So I know I got a penalty. And the exception under the scorecard, it says that if you fail to include penalty strokes that you did not know you incurred.
Yeah.
And I would say in this case, the exception would not apply. That would be my gut reaction. So I know I got a penalty. I just wrote it down on the wrong hole.
Okay.
So different than, here's the difference, Clarky. Let's suppose the purpose of that exception is, let's suppose I hit sand in the backswing when I'm making a stroke from a bunker, and I don't realize it. I don't know it's a penalty. Have no idea. And then I sign my scorecard. I turn it in. Competition's not closed. We're between rounds, and then it becomes known that I had this penalty. Well, then that's a case of that exception where because I didn't put penalty strokes in there because I didn't know I incurred them. So then that exception applies, and the committee can open up the scorecard, add the penalty strokes, and then close it. In this case, think of it this way. You did give yourself penalty strokes. You just put them on the wrong hole.
All right.
So in the case of the first hole where you should have had 2 higher, in effect, you signed for a score lower than you actually had. And but you got those 2 strokes somewhere else. You've got a higher score on the 5th hole, wherever you discovered it. So,
right.
Yeah. So in that case there, in my view, I think the exception does not apply.
I agree with you on that. I just want to get your opinion.
Paula, if you want to unmute yourself and ask the question you had put in there earlier, go for it.
Oh, hi, everybody. Yeah, I was in a tournament and we had a caddy shortage. So my opponent and I had to share a caddy, and my opponent and I had the same Callaway Epic driver. The caddy put our drivers in the wrong bags. I teed off with my opponent's Callaway, whose loft was completely different than my loft. What would the ruling be there?
Oh, that's a great question. So, well, again, you have the playing characteristics. They're all lumped into that one section. So you shared clubs, if you will, with the person you're sharing the caddy with. Had the clubs get switched and you realize it before anybody made a stroke, obviously we know you can then just give your other player the correct driver and switch them back, and there'd be no penalty to anybody. But if I make a stroke with this other driver, this other club, for the other person in my group, I now have violated the 14 club rule, and I'm going to get the penalty. And then we have to figure out, well, where did this happen during the round, and how many holes did I use this club? If I just did it on the one hole and then I realized, oh, wait a minute, this is not my club, I'm going to get in match play, we're going to finish the hole based on talent. First of all, we're going to switch the clubs back. I'm going to give this club back to my opponent, and then I can get my club back because she's carrying my driver. I can get my club back. And we're going to finish the hole based on our talent and then adjust the match. So if at the end of that hole, the match was all square, I would lose that hole, so my opponent would be one up. And I think we all know the mechanics of how that would work. In a stroke play setting, if this was on the 5th hole and I inadvertently used this other player's driver, I would get a 2-stroke penalty on that hole and make sure I got it on whatever hole that happened. I would put it on that hole. I would get a 2-stroke penalty. And then obviously that other player can get their club back that they chose for play. I hope I answered. I answered.
And then my caddy would get a lower tip.
Exactly.
For doing that.
Or you might say, you know what? I think I'll just carry my own sack the rest of the way.
Carry my own bag.
You're fired.
Thank you.
No problem. No problem. Any other questions?
Those are the only questions submitted so far, Tom.
Okay, good. Good deal. Lots going on there. Lots going on with the club rule. Let's talk about golf balls. Balls allowed played during the round. What if it breaks into pieces? And what do we do if it's cut or cracked when playing a hole? And here we go. Obviously, we have to use conforming golf balls. We all have the and let's not confuse it with the one ball rule, because one ball rule means you have to play with the same brand, Titleist Pro V1, whatever it is, throughout the round. And interestingly enough, the PGA of America hasn't used the one ball rule since 2006, I think was the last time when we switched over. So we don't have that on PGA of America's hard card. PGA Tours, all the major tours do have the one ball rule in effect. At the club level, I would not recommend having it in effect. Conforming balls are a different story. So you couldn't use remember that old Polara ball that was self-correcting and went straight? That ball did not conform. A ball that's too small doesn't meet the size requirements in the equipment rules. So again, we got to use conforming balls, and we can borrow golf balls. You know, there's always that thing, geez, if I run out of balls, can I borrow one from another player in my group? There's no problem with that. No problem at all. Okay, we cannot alter a golf ball. Keep in mind, this is deliberate, and we must not make a stroke at it. So very similar to a non-conforming club, the penalty is triggered when you make a stroke at it. The same thing applies to a golf ball that's been deliberately altered by scuffing it, by heating it, by applying a substance. So think about the winter leagues that are playing right now. If you deliberately heat a golf ball and then make a stroke at it, you are disqualified. So when you're playing in the Tom Smith's Winter League or Jamie Schaefer's Winter League, make sure you don't deliberately heat those golf balls. If you do it accidentally, not a problem. Let your conscience be your guide. Or by applying any substance. So I add something to the ball to influence its performance. Again, the only way I get a penalty is if I make a stroke at it. If I just get rid of that ball and I don't use it, then I got no penalty. The penalty is triggered by making a stroke, and the penalty is a severe one. It's a disqualification penalty. What if a ball breaks into pieces? We don't see this happen very often, but I have seen it happen in the member at Kennett Square when I was there. And if it did happen, there is no penalty and the stroke does not count. So we are going to cancel and replay. We're going to go back to where we played the previous stroke. So in Rule 14.6, it says if the stroke was made from the teeing area, I'm going to go back to the teeing area. I can re-tee it anywhere within that area. If it was played from the general area, a bunker or a penalty area, I'm going to drop it, a substituted ball in those areas. And the same thing on a putting green, I'm going to place it. But again, doesn't happen very often. If it does happen, we have a rule that covers it. If we fail to cancel and replay the stroke, well, now we've played from a wrong place, and we're going to get the general penalty, 2 strokes in stroke play, loss of hole in match play. And in stroke play, if it's a serious breach, well, then the penalty could be disqualification if we don't fix it. So what happens if a ball is cut or cracked while playing a hole? Lifting a ball. It used to say cut, cracked, or out of shape. Remember that? Well, then it was found out that the only way a ball could be out of shape is if it's cut or cracked. So they took that out, and now we're just dealing with the language of a ball is cut or cracked when playing a hole. So you can, 2 sections here about a procedure that we're not sure if it's cut or cracked, and we can lift it to see if it is, and then whether or not a ball can be substituted. So if a player reasonably believes, there's got to be some reason that the player thinks his ball is cut or cracked. Maybe the ball, it went and it hit the grandstand, or the player hit a shot with a wedge and they bladed it, so that they think this ball might be cut or cracked while playing a hole. This player is now allowed to lift it, to take a look at it. Now, keep in mind, there are some strings attached to this. We're going to let you lift your golf ball, but you must do a couple things. You must mark it, number 1, and the ball must not be cleaned in this instance. Even if you think underneath this big clump of mud, that's where the crack is or the cut, you cannot clean it. So you can mark it. You must mark it, must not clean it, except if you're on the putting green, mind you, because you can always mark, lift, and clean it on the putting green. Otherwise, you cannot clean it. And so now, if the player lifts it without reasonable belief, well, they're not entitled to lift it. Or if they fail to mark it, or they clean it when they're not allowed, any or all of these violations result in a 1-stroke penalty. So if you lift it without reasonable belief, you fail to mark it, and you clean it, all 3 of those things you violated, all pieces of this procedure, you're going to get 1 single 1-stroke penalty. So they all add up to 1. So if you lift it without reasonable belief, and you fail to mark it, well, you might as well go ahead and clean it, because you're already going to pay the price of a 1-stroke penalty. And we have this section here just basically just says, clarifies just what I said. This procedure is specific. You have to have reasonable belief. You have to mark it, cannot clean it. You violate any piece of that or all of them, you get 1-stroke penalty. All right, so a player may only substitute another ball if it's clear that this ball is cut or cracked. Again, we don't see this very often anymore. In the old balata ball days, it used to happen all the time. And this damage happened during the hole being played. If this crack was made 3 holes ago, and I finally decided I wanted to take this ball out of play because it was cut or cracked, well, too late. I have to do it on the hole which this damage occurred, which this cut or cracked was made. However, just having a scrape on it or its scratch does not make this ball cut or cracked. Hitting a cart path is not, have a scratch from a cart path, that ball is not cut or cracked. It's just got a scratch on it. So you'd have to play it as a lot. You would not be able to substitute it. Okay, so when can you substitute? If the original is cut or cracked, you can replace it with another ball or the original ball on the original spot. So you can go ahead and substitute in that case. If it's not cut or cracked, meaning it's got a scrape from a cart path, in that example that I gave you, well, then you're going to have to put the original ball back on the original spot. Now, we also have a host of other rules which allow you to substitute. So taking relief from an abnormal course condition, anytime you're dropping the ball, you go ahead and you can replace it. You still can substitute under those rules. But in this case right here, if we're just merely lifting the ball to see if it's cut or cracked, we can only substitute if it's cut or cracked. If it's not cut or cracked, we've got to put the original ball back, unless another rule allows us to substitute. That's what that means. So if I substitute when I'm not allowed, or I put the ball back in a wrong place, I'm going to get a total of the general penalty: 2 strokes in stroke play, loss a hole in match play. Any questions here on golf balls? All right, we're going to move into this last. I'm sorry, go ahead.
None have been submitted so far. Okay,
good. All right, last piece. And again, a lot of this is in the equipment rules, and I'm going to be the first to tell you, these always scare me, and I'm usually going to a higher level to get an answer about clubs, equipment. So let's dive right in. We're going to have our definition of equipment, what's allowed, what's not allowed, and then we have medical reasons where we're allowed to do things where ordinarily we couldn't. So our definition of equipment: anything used, worn, held, or carried by the player or the player's caddy. And we have all these examples down below. All that stuff is the player's equipment. Objects for care of the course, such as rakes, are equipment only while they're being held or carried by the player or caddy. So again, a rake lying on the ground is just a movable obstruction. It's also an outside influence. But when the player lifts it up and has it in their hand, or they're using it, held or carried by the player, well, now that's the player's equipment for the purpose of this rule. So this applies to all types of equipment that a player might use during the round. If we have an issue with clubs or balls, well, we're going to go to clubs. We're going to go to 4.1 to deal with a club question. We're going with a ball question, we're going to go to 4.2. Everything else, we're going to go to this section here, 4.3. And this rule talks about how it's used. It doesn't limit you from carrying it. You can carry any equipment with you, and what you're going to see is that it's the use of it that triggers a potential penalty during the round. So again, the player may use equipment to help his or her play during the round. And right here, obviously, we have a hat, we have gloves, we have shoes, we have a club, we have a golf ball. All that stuff is equipment, and this is allowed. Except when you have something where a player must not create a potential advantage by using this equipment. And what does it say here? Other than a club and a ball, that artificially eliminates or reduces the need for skill or judgment. So here you have a case where this player has put an alignment rod across his hips to see how much hip turn he has during the round. Well, that would not be allowed, and that would be a breach of this rule. So he's taken this piece of equipment and he used it to get an advantage. That would be a problem. What if I use equipment in making a stroke here? I got this ball and I stick it between my hands in an abnormal way to make a stroke. Now, if I'm just making a practice stroke, no problem. But if I use it to make a stroke at the ball like this, that's going to be a breach. And this internal definition of abnormal way, it just means different than its intended use or not normally recognized as part of playing the game. That, somewhat subjective, but I think we all know it when we see it, so to speak. And again, what we want to do is, this is just the rules playing traffic cop. It's saying if you have put this club down, this object down to assist you with alignment, or you anchor, we're going to send you to Rule 10.2 to deal with this setting of the object down for alignment purposes. So we're not going to go to Rule 4.3. We're going to go to Rule 10.2. The outcome is going to be the same. We're going to have a penalty, but this is just plain traffic copying, sending to the proper rule. Now, this rule is organized very nicely. There's 6 pieces here, and it gives you what's allowed, what's not allowed. So let's first talk about distance and directional information. We all know that we can use distance measuring devices. We can use a compass. That's okay. However, but we can't use this device to measure elevation changes, or we couldn't use this device to get a recommendation for a line of play or a club. That would be a breach of using this. Probably the most common thing here would be having a measuring device that's switched over to in the slope for slope, and you go ahead and you click on it, and it gives you the slope information. Well, that first time is going to be a breach. Let's hope that you realize it and you don't do it again. Now, certainly, by local rule committees can prohibit the use of distance measuring devices. All the major tours do this. PGA of America, for the first time last year, and at the PGA Championship and the Senior PGA, they allowed distance measuring devices. When I could tell that the effect was insignificant, we'll see what happens this year, whether or not they continue to allow them. Second section, wind and other weather conditions. You're allowed to go to a weather app and access a weather forecast, including wind speed. And the nuance here is that when you access an app, the wind speed has already been measured. You're not measuring anything. It's already been measured at a particular time. So that's why you're allowed to access that. Now, you couldn't, well, let me go back. You're allowed to measure temperature or humidity on the course. That's okay. What you're not allowed to do is measure wind, an anemometer. You couldn't use that to break one of those out and measure wind speed at a particular spot on the golf course, or use an artificial object to measure wind-related items using powder. Throw powder up in the air to see where the wind's going. That would be a problem. Information gathered before or during the round. So you might have swing tips or club recommendations that you wrote in your yardage book, or in this case here in this picture on the glove, grip pressure, a little swing tip. That's going to be okay, gathered before the round, no problem whatsoever. You can record physiological information such as or playing information, club distance, playing statistics, or heart rate. You can record all that, but you're going to see that where the problem is processing this information during the round or interpreting playing information, club recommendations, that's not allowed. All this physiological information that you recorded, you could not access that during the round. So recording it is one thing, accessing it and using it is not allowed. So you could use that after the round to look at the information and maybe help you for your next round of golf. Audio and video, this is a big thing in our world today. Everybody's got music playing. Or watching a video that's unrelated to the tournament you're playing in. Background music happens, all the time now when you see recreational golf, member guest events, very, very common. But this should be done, and you should always be courteous to the other players in your group. If someone thinks it's too loud, why not just lower it a little bit, and rather than tell them to turn it off, if you will. Hopefully you can come to an agreement. However, what you're not allowed to do is listen to music for the purpose of eliminating distractions or to help with your swing tempo. So Clarkey, let's suppose Clarkey said, you know what, I like to listen to Mel Torme, The Velvet Fog, I'm playing because it really helps me with my swing tempo. Well, that would be a violation. If he's only got the Velvet Fog on for background music, no problem. No problem. So there is a little bit of a distinction there between why this music is on. If you're using it to eliminate a distraction or help you with your tempo, that would be a violation of this rule. Also, looking at video of players during the competition that would help you with choosing a club or how to make a stroke, that would not be allowed. Now, if you're at a big event and there's big video boards that are playing replays of certain strokes, well, players can't control that, so that's not a problem. But if you pull out your cell phone and you start looking at the broadcast or videos of other players to help you with what club to choose, well, that's going to be a problem. Keep in mind that committees can restrict the use of music. You can say no music during the member guest. I'd be careful with that. I mean, I would go the route of saying, hey, folks, if you want to play music during the round, let's just make sure that you and your opponents or other players in your group, that everybody's okay with the volume and you're not disturbing other players. I think that's a more practical way to deal with it rather than prohibiting it and getting people upset at you. Gloves or gripping agents, you can use a plain glove. That's no problem. That's been in the rules forever, a plain glove, mind you. You can use resin powders, other moisturizing agents, drying agents. That's no problem. That's been around forever. You can wrap a towel or handkerchief around the grip. That's no problem. However, we have these training gloves that would not be allowed, where it used to have that bump in the grip, anything like that, a training tool, that would be a violation. This player here has this thing on their wrist that helps them with their restricting their for chip shots, maybe to avoid having a break in the wrist, whatever that is. That would not be allowed. Stretching or training aids for stretching. You can use any equipment for general stretching other than making a practice swing. So could you use a medicus for general stretching? Yes, you could. Could you make a practice swing with a medicus? No, you could not. So there is a distinction in that respect. Let me go back here for a second, real quick. Notice this down here where it talks about an alignment rod. Can I put an alignment rod across my shoulders and use it for stretching? The answer is yes. But what do we have here? But you couldn't use this training aid, alignment rod, or a weighted donut or head cover. And this is for a whole different purpose. This is to assess my hip turn. So that would be a violation. You couldn't put a donut on your club to help loosen up. That would not be allowed. And again, this is done to create a potential advantage or helping the player in preparing to make a stroke. Not allowed. Lots going on here. Here we have our interpretation of using green reading materials. If you have yardage books, we're not going to spend a lot of time on this. I would just recommend that you go look at this. If you're at a facility that has yardage books or your caddies have yardage books, make sure that they're using the proper size, and these grids inside these books need to match up with the proper green reading materials. The scale has to be correct. And as I mentioned, there is this plastic template that the USGA sells that you can use to measure for these books. For those of you that work at clubs that have caddies, just make sure that that's what's being used out there. And again, what triggers the breach here is using this when you have a stroke from the putting green or near the putting green with a putter where the ball will end up on the green. That's what triggers the penalty when we get into these green reading materials. If you want to use a magnifying, you can only use reading prescription glasses or lenses. You couldn't take out a magnifying glass to enlarge it. You can use handwritten notes. That's written by the player or his caddy, as long as it's on the same size paper as your yardage book. No problem whatsoever. If you have something electronic, these grids need to match the size, but keep in mind, if you enhance them and blow them up, that would be a breach. It's got to, you can't use the grid size beyond what's allowed. Lots going on here. Again, for further guidance on this, check in your equipment rules. And again, always go to the committee for help. The last piece, prohibited motorized transportation, as you know, on the regular tour, Corn Ferry Tour, they prohibit motorized transportation. Champions Tour, where I work, we have some events where they can use carts and some that are walking only, and we have to post information accordingly, depending on whether it's a walking only event. Last part of this rule talks about a medical exception. And here we have Paula Creamer back when she played in the U.S. Open. She had a rib problem. And players are not in breach of this if they use equipment here to help with a medical condition. And there's some criteria. Obviously, the player has a legitimate medical reason for using this equipment in this way. And the committee has decided that it didn't give this player any unfair advantage over other players. So a key point here, you can use tape or similar coverings. We see a lot of this out here now for any medical reason to prevent an injury or to help with an existing one. The key here is it cannot be excessive. And if it is applied excessively and this could help a player more than necessary to help a player with their swing, well, then we might have a problem. The key would be, if there's any questions, to go to the committee and say, hey, this is what I want to do. Am I allowed to do it because I have a bad wrist or a bad elbow, whatever it might be, and get your approval. Again, go to the committee and ask them, and then you'll avoid a problem. For all of these things in 4.3, the first breach would be a single act and would be a general penalty. So I use a rangefinder with the slope mechanism. I use that one time. Well, that's my first breach. If I use that slope mechanism a second time, then I'm going to get a DQ penalty. Or if I breach any other part of this rule. So if I use my slope mechanism on the second hole, I get the general penalty, and then I take my alignment rod out and I put it across my hips to help with my hip turn, that's my second breach, and that would be now I'm going to be disqualified because they're all under the umbrella of this 4.3. Okay, if I breach it between holes, the penalty applies to the next hole because what I did between holes could possibly assist me on the next hole. That's why when we say, does it apply to the hole just played or the next hole, in this case here, it's going to apply to the next hole. And again, for the second breach, they're going to be treated as unrelated, and it's going to be the second breach of 4.3 would be a disqualification penalty. And that's our finale here with 4.3. Lots going on. Any final questions here before we wrap up for the day?
Tom, while we're waiting for questions, I just want to thank you on behalf of everyone for your presentation. We are so fortunate that Tom stays involved at the section level, given his responsibilities on the tour. And I think these rules are hard enough to understand, but when we have somebody that's in the field actually doing it on a weekly basis, it really brings it to life. So thank you for that. And next week, Clarkey on Monday is going to cover Rule 6, playing a hole, and Rule 7, which is all about searching for and identifying your ball. Thank you, everybody, for participating, too. I know the rules, when we teach these big rules workshops, I always warn people, you know, it's like drinking from a fire hose because all this information comes at you. And we are trying to work through what we think are some of the most relevant rules for this series of 6 seminars, and it's still a lot of information. So as you go through and you look at it and have questions, please bring those to the next session. We'll be happy to try to answer them. Okay. If nobody has any questions, I also would like to thank Tom and Alice and Clark and everybody who's helping with these webinars. In addition to the rules webinar on Monday, we have the Coaching Summit in person on Tuesday. If you want to learn more about that, go to our website, and there's some information on the education tab there. Additionally, we're going to make a call probably today about the golf operations specialization seminar that's scheduled for next week. We've had a little bit of a lag in registration, so that may be canceled. So if you are seriously considering taking part in that seminar, please register through our Golf Genius today, but hold off on the course library just in case we do cancel. If you have any questions about that, shoot me an email at mfrey@pghq.com. And if not, we'll see everybody next week.
Okay, thanks, Matt.
Thanks everybody. Appreciate you all being here.
Absolutely.
Tom, thanks again, and safe travels wherever you're off to.